So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ajahn Brahm. Ajahn Brahm's a very difficult guy to nail down for these sorts of things because he travels all over the world giving talks all the time. And we actually had agreement for him to come and give this talk over 12 months ago. And so I'm very happy that he's come and to make this a really a tremendous success. Ajahn Brahm came from a working class background and won a scholarship to study theoretical physics at Cambridge University in the late 1960s. He graduated from Cambridge and taught in high school for a year before travelling to Thailand to become a monk. And he's been a monk ever since, as you can tell. He's the abbot of Bodhinyana Monastery in Western Australia, and in October 2004 he was awarded the John Curtin Medal for his vision, leadership and service to the Australian community. He's written a range of books, Open the Door of Your Heart. So I have read it. It doesn't sound like it. And the recent one, Good, Bad, Who Knows? Or as it's called in other countries, Don't Worry, Be Grumpy. Hundreds of Ajahn Brahm's talks are available online, and you can catch him some Friday nights with DST, daylight saving. It's probably about 11 o'clock at night here in Sydney now. But generally there's 100 to 200 people viewing online from all over the world, and he'll answer questions from all over the world. I don't know, so normally I do the meanings of names, but Ajahn Brahm is a bit more difficult to do. Ajahn is actually from the Thai language, it's the title, which translates as teacher. It's a bit like sensei in Japanese, and it's used as a title of address for high school and university teachers and Buddhist monks. Ajahn Brahm's talks are characterized by humor, honesty, practicality, and bad jokes. Some of you know what I mean, and the rest of you will know in a little while. But you certainly don't need to be Buddhist to get hooked on his talks. He's in great demand as a teacher and a speaker, and he spends as much time flying as the average 747, I think. He's famous for talking about topics off the cuff without preparation. So, like you, I have absolutely no idea what he's going to talk about, but I'm really, really looking forward to it. Oh, he doesn't either. Okay, well, let's find out.
Very good. This is the uncertainty principle in practice. I don't know what I'm going to say, but first of all, my name, Brahm. You should know this. It stands for B for Buddhist, R for Roman Catholic, A for Anglican, H for Hindu, and M for Muslim. If there's any Jewish people here, I do apologize. I could not fit that in. But the talk today is going to be something to do with the nature of consciousness and the mind and the brain. But first of all, I'm going to go on from what was said very beautifully this morning by Andrew about curvature. Because one of the things which I recall from my time at Cambridge, just as an undergraduate, was trying to describe the nature of space, give you some idea where you can get your head around a new framework. And to go back, first of all, to explain what I mean, maybe 200, 300 years ago, people in this planet thought the Earth was flat. But if you go so far that you come across an edge, a cliff or waterfall or something beyond which you could go no further. And that was the framework which ordinary people, even intelligent people, looked at this planet Earth. And of course, later on, we all found out that this Earth is round, is curved. And later on, with general relativity, we found that space is also curved. But what does that mean? And as a young man, I remember just when I wasn't looking at the girls, when I was thinking about the meaning of life, that I remember trying to contemplate, conceptualize, how can space be limited in size but not have any boundaries to it? And I sort of started to think, maybe you go so far into outer space, you come across a wall with some government sign, trespassers will be shot when you go past this point. Or a barbed wire fence or something. How can you have an edge to space? But of course, I knew there was a very simple mathematical proof that the universe cannot be infinitely large. It is limited in space, but cannot have any edges to it. And the way that was described to me, very beautiful in the lecture theatre, was somebody got a football, a basketball if you like, and imagine an ant crawling over the surface of that basketball. That ant crawling over the surface of the basketball will go round and round and round and soon discover that area of the basketball is limited in size. It doesn't go on forever, but it has no edges, no beginnings, no ends to the basketball. And that is a beautiful description of the space in which we live in. And that's pretty much accepted by everybody. But now, let's go to the next stage. Time. We still live in a flat time world, most people. And because it's flat time, we wanted to have edges, boundaries, beginnings and ends. In other words, religion. And you know that has been occupying the minds of theologists and philosophers for centuries. How can we have a beginning of time, basically the beginning of this universe? How can we have that? And you posit these gods, causes, whatever the first causes, but philosophers have always never been able to maintain that as a rational proposition. It's so easy to tear that apart. If there was a first cause, what caused the first cause? If God was there, what caused God? And that meant that we've never had a satisfactory explanation to the beginning of space-time, unless we start bending time. And when time is not flat anymore, it can be limited in duration. But just like the basketball, no beginnings, no ends, no edges, therefore no need for a God or a first beginning. Now, what I'm doing here is an example, not of theology, but of changing one's perceptual framework, the way we look at life, the way we look at the world, the way we look at ourselves. And that changing of ways we look at things, that was fundamental to the history of science, especially to physics. Just going to universities and having some of the greatest professors. And just last week I was in Cambridge visiting some friends and seeing some of the old wonderful places I went to. And probably the best lecture which I ever went to was in the chemistry labs, which are still there. And it was the, I think, 200th anniversary of Cambridge University's Astronomical Society. And I happen to be a member, so I managed to get a seat in the largest auditorium in Cambridge. And it was better than going to see the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. It was electric. The B lecturer, I forget his name now, but he was just a small physicist who discovered quasars. The A lecturer was this fellow which inspired me, Fred Hoyle. And he was then an occasion professor of physics at Cambridge. And he just threw out ideas which changed the way you looked at life. And that was so important as a physicist, as a scientist, not to actually to stay within the boundaries of your discipline. But one of my sayings, this is the first bad joke coming up. Did you used to watch Star Wars? You know one of the statements they used to say, to boldly go where no man has gone before. I adapt that as a Buddhist monk. I boldly go to where no one has gone before. In other words, to expand our perceptual frameworks, on things like just constants. Why should constants be constant? I don't know how many of you saw that lecture by the Cambridge physicist, he was a scientist, Rupert Sheldrake. He was on TEDx TV, challenging the dogma of science, making a distinction between scientific method and scientific dogma. And that's why I appreciated your talk, Andrew. You were just busting some of the dogmas of science. And scientific dogma is what restricts the growth of knowledge. And scientific method is everything can be questioned. We expand our framework of views, see it in totally different ways. And I did notice that in this institution, it's the Institution for National Measurements. And I remember Fred Hoyle getting up there at Cambridge, this was 45 years ago, and saying, why does the speed of light have to be constant? Why even does big G, the universal gravitational constant, need to be constant? And this fellow doesn't just ask the question. Fred Hoyle made the question, Rupert Sheldrake answered it. Because apparently, in institutions such as this, they measure big G every year or two. And so do many other institutions worldwide. And he got the research, got the figures, and showed that even something you learned in high school physics, the universal gravitational constant, does change significantly in the same laboratories throughout the world. It changes same time indifferently. That starts underlining some of the basic propositions of science, which I think that is real science. Everything should be challenged. And of course, after a person like Rupert Sheldrake said that on TEDx channel and said that science was dogmatic, he was the first person ever to be taken off TEDx channel. He was banned. And as a result, he said, that proves my point. And he was instantly reinstated. So I like challenging. And so, the challenging of the nature of consciousness, the brain, the mind, this is really important, because this will change the way we look at our world. If we can somehow understand, the theory which I'm porting out now is the mind is much, much bigger than the brain. This is a simple philosophical argument, which I got from a 6-year-old child. She later went on to do postgrad research at Oxford in, biochemistry. She was 6 years old at the time when her teacher in grade 1 at school asked the whole class, what is the biggest thing in the world? My daddy, said one little girl. No, an elephant is much bigger than her daddy. No, a mountain, said another kid. And the daughter, Pascal, of my friend in Cambridge, put up her hand and said, my eye is the biggest thing in the whole world. The teacher didn't understand what she meant. What do you mean your eye is the biggest thing in the whole world? Well, said this 6-year-old genius, my eye can see her daddy, it can see an elephant, it can see a mountain, and so much more. If all of that can fit into my eye must be the biggest thing in the world. Now that was brilliant. It was changing perspective to get a conclusion which was quite groundbreaking. And when I heard about that, I sort of said, your daughter gets 9 out of 10, not 10 out of 10. Because this thing we call the human mind, don't define it, just as a normal person will understand it. Your mind can see everything your eye can see. They can also see things you'll never see in the real world. Imaginary objects, fantasy objects. It can also hear, smell, taste, touch. And it can also have its own area, which the other senses just cannot reach. In fact, everything that can ever be known can fit into your mind. Therefore, the mind is the biggest thing. Not the biggest thing in the world, because you can know the world fits into your mind. Now, once you start to have that framework, it's a different way of looking. You might not think it's absolutely true, but it's as true and as valid as probably any other way of looking at this thing we call the human mind. It's experiential, and it makes sense to you subjectively. So once we start with that, the mind, and everything in the world fits in to the mind. Does the mind fit into the brain? Or does the brain fit into the mind? That is a fascinating question. And of course, we need, because this is CSIRO, we need evidence. What's the evidence for this? And there's heaps of evidence, which I love saying to people. Now, of course, once I moved from Cambridge to Thailand to a monastery to become a monk, I spent all these years meditating, days meditating, 40 years as a monk now, meditating. My experiment has been observing my mind and other people's minds as well, and seeing how this thing works, which is one of the reasons, as I said last night in another talk, they look to monks like me for advances in psychology, and it works. And so, the nature of the mind, according to meditation, what is it? One of the things which we do is go into such deep states of stillness that things disappear. This is just basic, the nature of the way our brains are wired. I once went to a Zen monastery. I was not a monk yet. And I was asked to meditate just facing a wall, a whitewashed wall, staring at it for hours. After about 20 minutes or 25 minutes, a strange experience happened. The wall vanished. It disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. Now, this was the late 60s, and I was into weird experiences. Weird was cool in those days. So also this is great. I wasn't afraid. But I wondered what was happening. Why did that wall disappear? And of course, it's so obvious to anybody who knows anything the way the brain is wired. Your brain can only notice things which change. When they stay the same, like the sound of the air conditioner, like the taste of saliva in your breath, like just the hum of the air, which you can only usually hear if you put a glass to your ear or the old shell to your ear, which you used to do as a kid. If it's constant, it disappears. So by looking at a wall, focusing on it, because nothing was changing, the brain turned off its sense of sight. And that is the key to Buddhist meditation. Becoming so still that things disappear. They vanish. Poof. They're gone. Now there's some people, that's scary, but it's also great fun. Because what happens is your body disappears, you stop breathing, and the brain stops. I know there's been many experiments done on meditators, but none yet which I have seen on a meditator who's gone into a deep meditation. But every now and again something happens. And this particular story I wrote about because it's anecdote, but anecdotes as good evidence as anything else in my book. One of my students, named Greg, he was meditating at home one Sunday afternoon. Usually only does 30 or 40 minutes meditation and so on. And nothing on the TV. He told his wife, I'm going to the bedroom to meditate. After an hour and a half, he hadn't come out. So his wife went to check on him. He saw her husband in the room meditating, perfectly still. Too still. His chest was not moving. There was no breath discernible. So she immediately rang 000. And an ambulance came within 5 minutes. And the medicos checked his pulse. There was no discernible pulse. Straight into the gurney, the back of the ambulance, with his wife worried sick, also in the ambulance, straight to Sir Charles Gardner Hospital on a Sunday afternoon. Straight through triage into the emergency room. ECG, flat. EEG, flat. He was dead. So they thought. But he was very, very lucky. Of course, he told me about this afterwards. He wasn't dead. He was just meditating, that's all. And he was so lucky that the person on duty that afternoon his parents had migrated from India. And they had heard that some people in deep meditation can suspend their life activities such as the brain and the heartbeat. And here was such a case. If he hadn't been from India, he would have sent this poor man down to the morgue. And when this poor man came out for meditation, he would have probably killed the attendants in the morgue when he sort of just woke up. But what happened next was the doctor on duty decided to try defibrillators, electric shocks put on the body. And you may have seen that, on the movies, or seen that on the documentaries. It makes you jump off the gurney. They're very violent, the electric shocks, trying to get your heart going. Nothing worked. He didn't actually say how long. It was many, many times he was trying to resuscitate this guy until the man came out from his meditation. Opened his eyes, bent up. How did I get in here? And immediately, beep, beep, beep. The monitors were perfect. The doctor gave him a quick checkup, could see nothing wrong with him at all, and so he walked home with his wife. During that time, he said he was perfectly aware, fully conscious, but not of his body, just of inside, what we call the mind. And it was an entirely pleasant experience, the most pleasant experience he'd ever had in his whole life, except for one thing. The scolding he got from his wife on the way home. Don't you ever do that again. No more meditation for you. You scared me. I thought you were dead. Now that's only anecdotes of what happens in our tradition of Buddhism when a person meditates that deeply. Basically, the body gets so still, everything turns off. There is no brain activity. All there is the mental activity of the mind. Sometimes that can occur for other people. For example, what we call NDEs, the near-death experiences. Now this is one area. I'm just telling the head of this department here, the physics, that some scientists, it was actually Carl Sagan, he came up with this statement: extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And I really object to that. It's like saying that, say Tony Abbott saying that anything the Labour Party says is extraordinary, and they need much greater standard of proof than it was said by the Tory party. Who decides what is an extraordinary claim? And who decides what the level of evidence is? And I've been going around to many, many universities, and I'm surprised. The evidence is strong, is convincing. If it was any other area of research, it would be accepted as proof. But sometimes when it gets to consciousness studies, the level of proof required to prove something like the mind existing beyond the brain is so high that no one can reasonably reach it. This is one of the reasons why I object to the uneven playing field, where some things don't require much proof. Other things, because we don't believe them, require too much proof. So the standard of proof is just of the ordinary being, the ordinary person. Will it convince them? And sometimes I prefer philosophers to actually decide whether these things are true or not. Please excuse me, not scientists. The reason is because scientists are biased. On the walls of the Cavendish Laboratory in 1969, when I was there, Cavendish Laboratory was a physics laboratory at Cambridge, there was scrawled the following graffiti: the eminence of a great scientist is measured by the length of time he or she stops progress in their field. I think you understand what I mean. So that's why we need someone outside of science to judge whether this is proved or not proved. Philosophers are great because they are not scientists. They are like objective judges. So I would love, instead of peer review in science, peer review is just like the New South Wales Police Force investigating claims of abuse. Okay, it's your friends. So that's why it's great to have something objective outside. So NDEs, there's so much great evidence. Professor Pim van Hol, Netherlands, first fellow who got published in the Lancet in 2001, always hearing claims of people who were dead, claiming to float outside of their body, claiming to hear and see conversations and activities, and being able to come back with memory, claiming to have seen and heard things which really happened. Now, that was just anecdotes. So this fellow, Professor Pim van Hol, decided to check this out. You know, he was about to retire. He was the head of 3 hospitals in the Netherlands. His sample base was every patient who came into those hospitals under cardiac arrest, everyone who survived. Obviously, those who survived, he couldn't do much about. But those who survived, he gave a questionnaire to see whether they had any of these symptoms of near-death experiences, making all necessary measures to make sure that they weren't coerced, they weren't encouraged. It was a rigorous scientific experiment. At the same time, recording everything which was said and done in the triage area, operating theatre if necessary, to see if what they remembered actually occurred, and make sure that their recall was not contaminated by making those questionnaires come pretty early in their recovery, before they were told by the nurses, the doctors, or whoever else was there what had occurred. Make sure the evidence could not be contaminated. And he found that 9% of people reported near-death experiences. But his great discovery was that those 9% were the people who not just had cardiac arrest, which were also brain dead at the time. And the whole paper in the Lancet was arguing that this could not be an effect of the brain. The brain was dysfunctional at the time. It couldn't be an effect of the brain. And of course, that started causing an uproar, simply because it was expanding the normal framework of views on which people believe and make their science. And of course, there's many other experiments that have been done since. Professor Peter Fenwick, who's the other people I forget now, but there's a huge amount of research done on near-death experiences. And of course, those near-death experiences, when your body stops, when your mind separates from the body, are exactly the same thing you do as a meditator. Your mind releases from the body. It doesn't go to another place, but release, your body stops. Now that is classic Buddhist meditation. And there's so many stories of people who do that. One fellow, I love anecdotes, because they make the talk more interesting. There's one fellow, and I can't lie, I'm a monk, I've got very strong precepts. Those of you who know me know that monks can't lie. There's one fellow I knew when I was a young monk in Thailand. He's dead now, so I can tell his name. His name was Sudama, who's an Indonesian. He told me personally that when he was a young man, he went into the jungles of Java, must have been about 45 years ago, to meditate, to be a hermit. And he was sitting down in the jungles, and he said to me, this big star came to him in his meditation. He said he married that star, merged with it. But when he came out, it was many days later, and the jungle had changed around him. He checked with the villagers. There had been a flood. He'd been there for about 7 or 8 days, and he'd been underwater, about 2 meters of water, hadn't known a thing, perfectly happy, survived. Now these are experiences I get as a monk, and I know these things. He was also, for those of you who like weird things, you usually don't tell this to people when these monks are alive, because otherwise people just make them into saints or gods or something. One of the princesses of Thailand I knew, she told me she was in a meditation class with this guy. She realized something was weird was happening. She opened her eyes and she said, just like you see in the movies, rays, beams of light coming out from his eyes. Freaked her out. But real. So these are stuff, some of the stuff which I've seen, which don't make any sense. But because they don't make sense, it doesn't mean they're not true. It means that you have to change your framework of views, to expand them, to accommodate the evidence. It's one of the sayings. Never allow your views, your beliefs to stand in the way of truth. Always bend your beliefs to fit the facts. Never bend the facts to fit your beliefs, in religion or in science. Otherwise, truth is lost. And the other piece of evidence which we're really into, and I want to really push because it changes the world, reincarnation. You know that in the 6th century, the Christian Pope Vigilius, he was put in jail by the Emperor Justinian for believing in reincarnation. They put the Pope in jail for 1 year until he recanted his belief. And then afterwards, Justinian organized a council in which they made reincarnation a heresy in the Catholic Church. It's remained the same since 6th century, on coercion from the boss of the empire. And Vigilius, the Pope, was put in jail for a year. They don't do that these days. But evidence is strong. Professor Ian Stevenson, University of Virginia, did incredible research. Again, this interesting subject, let's actually stop all the anecdotal and ideas, let's see if it's true or not. And to be able to actually to assess people who had spontaneous recall of previous lives, kids. Get to them as soon as possible before their recall is contaminated by what other people say to them. Make sure there is no other feasible, plausible way they can gain that information, and then check if the information is correct. And this guy, Professor Ian Stevenson, collected so much information, and he got the best cases, published them. I remember seeing this video of a professor of philosophy who said, it doesn't matter that we don't know how it works. The very fact it does work is enough as a proof that this is a real phenomenon. And he said, that Scott is in this room here. That's truth. I didn't know how he come in. I didn't see you come in, Scott. But you're here, so I don't doubt you. I don't have to find out how did you come in before I believe you're sitting right in front of me. So sometimes the way these things work should not be used, or the lack of knowledge of how reincarnation works should never be used rationally as a means for rejecting it. If we can find enough people who believe that they've lived before, check the information, see if it checks out. And if it does, as this Professor Alvarez, who's a professor of philosophy in the United States, said, rationally, there's only one plausible solution, explanation to this. Unless someone can come up with another one which fits the facts, and which is more plausible, and that was that these people lived before. And have got memories. How on earth can they have a memory of a previous life when there's no part of the previous body in the body they're living in right now? Memory cannot just live in the brain. It lives somewhere else. So this is one of the other reasons why that a person can recall early life memories and past life memories. It's what we do in meditation. Find out who we were before. Very simple method. We have to have a powerful mind to be able to do it. And of course, many people have done that. And if it's personal experience and it checks out, you find out who that was. Recently, one of our members in Perth, okay, I'll say, he's a reservist for the SAS. He runs his own business in Perth. I shouldn't give you more information because he said, don't let people know because this might be bad for my business. And they might think I'm a bit weird. His brother, was having some emotional problems. And so he went to a regression therapist, who happens to be one of our past presidents. And he said he was on an exercise just an hour before, which was probably meant all his defenses were down. He was exhausted. He was very easily put in hypnotic trance and asked to recall something. And he recalled, because remember he told all the monks about it, he recalled seeing the redcoats on a jetty in Perth, Western Australia. And he gave the date. There were redcoats at that time, English soldiers, and he was wearing a brown uniform, which he never really knew what it was. Checked out afterwards that people in Britain over 120 years ago were recruited for 3 years as guards to the convicts. And if they volunteered for 3 years' work, after that time they would be given a grant of land. He recalled being from a small town in Ireland, having just no hope in the world, and this was a way to actually get a life. And he volunteered for this. And afterwards, he remembered meeting his wife, got their names, and moving down to a small town in the southwest of Western Australia where he built his own house out of stone, where he had his kids, he remembered their names, remember when one of them died, which was a really traumatic experience for him, and then ending his life in the town of Albany in the south of Western Australia. All recorded under hypnosis, and afterwards he didn't believe it until he checked it out, because those records are there. Everything fact, except when he went to see the position of his own stone house. He went to the farm farmer showed him where it was because it was heritage listed. Anything heritage listed, you cannot touch. So he showed him this old house, and this isn't it. And the farmer got very embarrassed because he knew where the house was. He took the farmer to the house because the farmer had bulldozed the house. He'd broken the law. And he never wanted to admit, but this guy knew where it was. When you get perfect recall like that, very often the people say, well, can you explain it in any other way? Information which cannot be obtained by any other sources. Now once one starts to add all this information, sometimes we use the principle of convergence. One particular type of evidence may be suggestive. When all the evidence from many different sources points in the same direction, that convergence is a very, very powerful argument. Mind being able to influence the brain, and the other way around, but the mind being totally separate. I don't know if there's anybody here who's had the personal experiences with someone with dementia and being at their bedside when they pass away, not having remembered anybody for months or even years, and when just before they died, 5 minutes of clarity, recognizing everybody. This is very not uncommon, not research, but it'd be really good to do research into the recall of dementia patients a few seconds or minutes before they pass away. It happens. It's there. One anecdote from my disciples in Perth, they were just holding their hand of their father in a coma for days, waiting for him to do his last breath. Because I'm a monk, I do that sometimes, stay by people when they're dying. And you may have had that experience, holding the hand of a loved one. They stop breathing, you think this is it. And they're breathing again. That happens so many times before finally the last breath goes out and the new one doesn't go in anymore. You don't know when that moment is. So I know what these two daughters were doing, holding their father's hands, waiting for that time which they could not predict, when his last breath went out and the new one never came in. And holding his hand, and then, without any warning, he opened his eyes, bent up, looked at his two daughters, and they just said, "We love you, Dad." He smiled, and there he died. The last moments of clarity, when the brain is not functioning anymore. I love those little pieces of evidence. The brain, or rather the mind, separating from the brain. Hypnosis is a great way to access that mind. You can get memories, which you should be able to get. People brain damaged cannot remember things, but when you hypnotize them, they can. Two different types of memory. And so, great if we have some research on that. Great if we can put it on a more scientific footing. But what I've done here today is not just to tell you what to believe, but to try and expand your frameworks, to challenge you. When I was in Dalhousie University a couple of weeks ago, I had a tea with the president, and I told him that your university should change its motto to this, and he really thought it was a great idea. He put it on his website, tweeted it all over, where everybody thinks the same. No one thinks at all. So I've thought in a different way today, just to stir you up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll probably have questions. Would anyone like to start with the first question?
Yeah. Okay. For the fellow who was in the hospital, that was just the EEG. For the near-death experiences, one of the most wonderful cases was where it was recorded on BBC. There was a lady who had an aneurysm at the base of her brain. No doctor in the United States was willing to operate because chances of survival were very small. And it was the beginning of people experimenting with cryogenic freezing, taking the body to such a low temperature that they could actually do these amazing operations. That's what they did. Froze her, opened up her skull, literally took the brain out to get underneath where the aneurysm was at the base of the skull, fix it up, put it back in again, thaw her out and hope for the best. Of course she survived. And she gave all the legal documents that whatever happened she would not prosecute because the doctors needed that. But the anaesthetist was part of Peter Fenwick's program on near-death experiences. And so I don't know the names of these things, every gizmo on the planet, checking her brain. And he said if one neuron fired, he would be able to see it. During that whole operation, the brain was at such a low temperature, no neuron fired. And she had perfect recall. And they recorded everything to make sure that if she did recall something, they could check its veracity. A perfect recall of many, many things which happened. Exactly. This was the most important thing, because Susan Blackmore of Oxford has been the main person opposing near-death experiences. And she was on this interview, she said, I can't explain that one. Because they try and make near-death experiences cases of hypoxia. This is actually low oxygen in the brain, which happens when you're dying. So that will be when you're dying. But this is actually right in the middle of the operation, where hypoxia is not a valid explanation for those effects. And even if it was hypoxia, it would be delusions, fantasies. In fact, it was real conversations, seeing real actions. Like in this one, I remember she recorded, she had false teeth, taking out the false teeth, and there's a whole row of drawers in the operating theatre, and she said it was the third row, fourth on the left or something. Perfect, accurate. Which was really quite convincing.
Over here, yes.
Exactly. They asked the same question of Holiness the Dalai Lama. He said, yes, we'd have to reject it. Because that's part of the Buddhist methodology. There is some parts of Buddhism, like the origin of their universe, which doesn't make sense. But we reject that. So that doesn't make any sense. But some of the heart of those teachings is more like a methodology rather than a dogma. And just like science should be, there should be nothing in science or nothing in religion which you can't question. As I mentioned, never allow your beliefs to stand in the way of truth. So I hope I'm courageous enough, and I should do, and I do, to reject it if its evidence is contradictory.
There's one here.
Great. Yeah. And this is also a very good question, because it comes on from Tim's question earlier. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago here in Sydney, there was a Vietnamese monk led a retreat, 9-day retreat, meditation retreat. Usually what happens on a Friday evening, everyone has some supper, and then start with half an hour meditation, followed by the introductory talk, and it goes on for 8.5 days. They did the introductory meditation, but they never had a talk. Because after the half an hour, the monk was still meditating. Another hour went past, he was still meditating. And so they all went to bed. And they got up in the morning, he was still meditating. He never moved for 8 days. Never went to the toilet, never drank any water. Was totally there, in full view of everyone for 8 days. When he came out of his meditation, he apologized. He just got into a very deep state. But apparently all the Buddhists there, they were so impressed. They said, no, it's great, it's so inspiring to see that these things can happen. We saw it for 8 days. So, what you do in those experiences, you do lose any concept of time. I often say the subjective experience of time is a measurement between the past and the present to the future, or the past to the future. One of the things you do in meditation, you come right smack bang in the present moment until there is no future for you. There is no past. So the subjective experience is timelessness, which is one of the reasons you can sit for long periods of time, literally days. It doesn't mean anything to you. But the other part of it, which is fascinating, is that monk, that Vietnamese monk's error, was not actually programming in the time of his meditation, which is what deep meditators do. If I'm going to go into one of those deep states, I say, I have to be out by 5 p.m. I got an appointment. You actually do that. And it's incredible just how 5 p.m. you just come out of your meditation. There is some sort of body clock inside of you to be able to do that. And you don't even need to sort of keep looking at the clock, 5 p.m. here, 5 p.m. You trust that. And it works every time. Just like you may all know that, if you haven't done it already, tonight when you go to bed, you may have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, say. Put your alarm clock to 7:05. I say this just so people don't get afraid. And tell yourself, as you go to bed at night, very clearly, full attention, I will wake up at 7 a.m. I will wake up at 7 a.m. I will wake up at 7 a.m. And just go to bed. It's incredible how well that works. It shows there is a body clock in there. And you just wake up 1 or 2 minutes either side of 7 a.m. A little experiment you can try this evening or the next day. There is a body clock, but there's also meditation, something else happens. Yes?
Yes?
Yeah. 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 Indeed. But this is the best explanation we have at this time. So, like everything else in science, it's always work in progress. There are no truths in science. And there was a former head of Royal Prince Alfred Hospital here in Sydney. A GP told me this story, great anecdote. He was about to retire, and he addressed the new intake of med students. And he began his lecture, this is my last year, 50% of what we're going to teach you in the next 4 years is wrong. My problem is we don't know which 50% it is. And that's a scientist. Even in physics, it's still work in progress. We should never think that we've got all the answers. Same in religion. Always work in progress. But at the present time, this seems to fit the facts. Yes. Yeah, those are what we call near-death experiences. That's the official name by people researching that area. So that's out-of-the-body experience, near-death experiences. And they're not uncommon. Many people have those experiences. And when they go out, they actually see real things. They check up on it afterwards. There was a classic case of the person floating out of the body in an operating theatre somewhere in England, and one of the old hospitals. And they floated high up. Like in any lecture theatre, if we do have any windows, they're high up. So that during the lecture you can't look through the window and see what's going on outside. So high windows, and this fellow, woman, I forget which, she floated up outside her body, and she said there was a tennis shoe on the ledge of the window, which was not visible from when you stood, even for a tall person stood on the floor. And people rejected that. How can you have a tennis shoe in an operating theatre which is supposed to be sterilised and clean? But she insisted she saw one up there, and of course, the reason I tell this story is because someone got a ladder up and found there was one up there. And that really blew people's minds, because it showed it was a piece of evidence which no one knew about, and which you can't see from the floor. You have to be floating up. Those are very suggestive anecdotes. You put them all together, and they become the principle of convergence. This is the best explanation for the evidence we have.
One here, and then Oliver.
Okay. So the mechanism which gets you out of such a deep meditation, basically just the same as what brings you back when you go on a holiday. You've run out of money. So you have to come back to work again. They run out of peacefulness. So they have to come back and make some more. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Go on. Yeah. Ah. It is like creativity, adventure, rebelliousness. I often say all religions should be rebellious. We should be getting people into trouble, getting ourselves into trouble. Because religions should be outside of the box. To think outside of the box, you have to live outside the box. Wear a strange costume like me. So when you live outside the box, you've got a good chance. So actually how you stop those views is actually, obviously evidence comes up, and we interpret that through our views. But some evidence comes up which is so challenging. A good example is like, the beginnings of quantum physics. The famous argument between Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, brilliant as he was, could not expand his world of views to actually embrace quantum science. He rejected it. He was wrong. And this was every time in the history of our humankind. We come across these barriers and we resist it. We resist it because of the comfort of our old views until the evidence just gets so strong. It just breaks apart the old views and creates a new way of looking at things. That whole process of rebelling, changing, everyone thinks the same, no one thinks at all. That should be the heart of universities, the heart of research. Your job is not to confirm old views, but to be the most rebellious institution in humanity. To break new ground, to take it further. As I said, to boldly go when no one has ever gone before. That's a challenge. That's what I loved about universities. I found, even in Cambridge, it was far too conservative.
We have a question over here.
Of course, if that happens, that would be fine. But it wouldn't disprove the fact that somebody can, and does, and what they hear and see is valid. So what we see that some people do, some people don't. But the fact that some people do, you can have many particle collisions in the Large Hadron Collider. Most of them don't produce a Higgs boson. One does, and you get Nobel Prize.
Question at the back there. Yeah. Either of you two?
Yeah. 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 Yeah, sure. Sure, I mean, this guy, he was a peasant in Ireland, and his mother weaved flax. And he described the town, the little hut, and the hopelessness of the poverty at that time. And also the internal challenge of working for the British or the English when he was Irish. He said just how difficult that was for him, ideologically. But, it was survival. Poor person. No one famous at all. But the nice thing about these things is you have to, in a previous life, if you want to check it out, be someone in like a Western country, because they have records. If it was in the Andes, there's no way of checking out whether that peasant lived or not. Which is why the stories you hear, the ones which can be proved, are usually people who have been born in Western countries in recent years where there were records kept, so you can check whether their memories are accurate or not.
I might ask one myself, and
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about Ian Stevenson before, and I searched it up, and it's very compelling stuff. But for me, it comes down to it's the principle of parsimony, and I can either say, well, what's likely, that guy is a fraud, or that it's real, and I think this is where it comes to extraordinary evidence, because in order to overturn the principle of parsimony, one of two things is going to have to happen for me personally. Either it's going to have incredible proof, or I'm going to have to actually experience something like that myself. But until I do experience it, I don't think anyone's going to produce enough proof for me.
Indeed, this is one of the big problems, because one of my friends went to visit him just a few months before he died. He brought back signed copies of his research for our monastery library, and he was a very bitter man. And the reason he was bitter, because he said, I am a professional scientist. He was a doctor, he did a professor of psychology or psychiatry, University of West Virginia. He had all the academic qualifications. His research was as rigorous as you could possibly make it. And he said, why did the whole scientific community just reject his research without really examining it, without giving it a fair trial? Please excuse me, but it's like maybe in the United States some years ago, if you were black, you had no possibility of a fair trial. You were thought to be guilty, your ethics were not as good as the white people just because who you were. In this case, it's a discrimination because not of the colour of the researcher, but the nature of the research. It's too threatening. I'd probably believe it straight away, simply because in the Buddhist theory of things, this body is just a vehicle, and this mind is the driver. And just like, you can smash a vehicle, you get another one, and you move into the new one. That's a sort of very simplistic version of the process of reincarnation, but it's fair enough. So just like a person can get reborn into the animal will, dog or a cat, parrot, and parrots can get reborn into the human realm. And this whole idea of human beings being so superior that just that going from one species to another is repugnant to many people. Just go and Google in Alex the Parrot. ALEXTHEPARROT. And it's worth Googling to see a parrot who uses language intelligently. You can have a conversation with it. A parrot. This is not Hollywood, this is not special effects. A real African grey parrot who was taught how to speak using a method developed for children with learning disabilities. And it has enough language that it shows he uses it intelligently, with emotions. It's spooky, but it's real. Alex the Parrot. It shows you that the difference between human beings and animals is not that great. So, we could get reborn into many places, and why not?
We'll just take two more. Sorry.
Being incarnated
Two more
into
questions.
a machine.
Sorry.
Why not? Go ahead. So maybe ask the machine if you can remember its previous life.
Probably a mobile phone.
Yeah. Go on. Just on my official day, those who come to my talks know this so many times. Now I'm going to hold this water perfectly still now. Does it stop moving yet, Christy? So I'll concentrate. So stop moving you. This is how people meditate. You try and stop the mind. It never stops. You'll try. You put it down, leave it alone. In a few seconds it will stop by itself. That's how you become still. By letting go of all this trying, all this controlling. And then your mind becomes still, and then things vanish. The trouble is, most people are control freaks. They just can't do this. They're scared to let go. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Yeah, over there.
Indeed, of course, because practice makes perfect. The more you experience it, the more you understand the mistakes you make. And what I just described now, my teacher did similes like that years ago, but I never got it. But you know, after a while you make mistakes, you do it this way, do it that way. Now you learn how easy it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, anesthetizing someone is totally different than meditation. And even near-death experiences are different. So this is another form of just stillness which allows the body to vanish. And just come into this state of just being with the mind. And basically, because you're not doing anything, you don't need an intake of oxygen. You don't need sort of to pump blood. It's still. The car does not need to consume petrol when it's just parked in the garage. But the car can be turned on again and driven again. It's the best image I can give to what happens in deep meditation. You don't die. The body gets parked in the garage.
We'll have to cut it off there, I'm afraid, to stay on track. Ajahn,
Okay,
thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I said I didn't know what you were going to talk about, and I wasn't expecting that at all. I have got a gift for you, but I know that monks have rejected material possessions, and so I think they want for nothing. So I thought, what am I going to do? Well, I'll get him nothing. So, have a book on nothing. So,
nothing doing. Thank you so much. Okay.
I thought he was going to say thanks for nothing then.